$500 million. That's 7%. 7% of $6.6 billion. Ambassador Pakistan, Ann Patterson, the ambassador to Pakistan, not anymore. I believe she left in '09. This is what she wrote to the State Department from Pakistan. There is, in 2009, there is no chance that Pakistan will view enhanced assistance levels in any field as sufficient compensation for abandoning its support for militant groups, which it sees as an important part of its national security apparatus against India. The ambassador to Pakistan is saying more aid will not get them to stop supporting jihadi groups. We know the money is not being spent the way we want it to, and what do? We pass a $7.5 billion aid package, the largest in the history of aid to Pakistan. The question of whether or not Pakistan is willing or unable, everybody in Washington is consumed by this question. Is it the fact that they don't want to go in, they can't go in, or do they just not have the resources? Is it intent, or is it capability? We go back and forth on this all the time. I would suggest people listen to the Vice Chief of the United States Army, General James Cartwright. Make no mistake about it. The evidence is unequivocal that the government of Pakistan and the military leadership of Pakistan aids and abets militant sanctuaries. We have clear evidence to that. That's the reality. It's not a question of unable or unwilling. They willingly support those sanctuaries. Now, I'll give you one more. Peter Lavoie, now the chairman of the National Intelligence Council. The ISI provides intelligence and financial support to insurgent groups to conduct attacks in Afghanistan against the Afghan government, the US-led coalition, and Indian targets. Now, I don't know how much more clearly this can be said, and by the United States' own government officials. This is not outside experts. This is not some Indian trying to sell, his point of view that we should be careful, it might be biased. This is the United States' own experts. Yet, policy has not translated. It's a very discouraging picture. However, I really do finally see some of this changing. And I again quote from an article of mine that will be coming out in the spring. I believe the terms of the entire debate over Pakistan are shifting. A young generation of U.S. policymakers have no fond Cold War memories to draw from, only a strong association between Pakistan and Islamist extremism. Behind closed doors, even Pakistan's many remaining advocates in Washington are losing the zeal to defend the country from charges it is playing a double game. There are simply too few left who would believe them. Secretary Clinton has called Pakistan, says they pose a mortal threat to the security and safety of our country and the world. This is not the type of language you would have heard 5, 10, even 15 or 20 years ago. But it's a generational shift, it's a shift in thinking, it's a shift in mindset, and it's something I think we need to give time to propagate throughout the levels of government. But it's important to know that it's there. And actually, I think this shift will be even more profound in the wake of the assassination of Salman Taseer. I think this is an important story. It's a current event, but it's indicative of the state of affairs in Pakistan. Here was the governor of Pakistan's Punjab province, assassinated by his own bodyguard, Mumtaz Qadri. This is a bodyguard who told his fellow policemen that he was going to assassinate the governor ahead of time. His fellow bodyguards watched him pump 26 bullets into the governor without saying a word. This man has been hailed as a hero in Pakistan, a hero for assassinating a governor, and the governor's offense was that he wanted to amend Pakistan's blasphemy law. He didn't even want to cancel or uproot Pakistan's blasphemy law. He just wanted to amend it so that the penalty was not death, but 10 years in prison. This man is being hailed as a hero for killing an innocent government official. It's almost beyond belief. And, people in the United States have been taken aback, not only by, this heinous crime in itself, but you have seen Pakistan lawyers' associations and religious groups that the United States considered the tolerant, moderate section of Pakistani society. You know, everyone was enamored with the lawyers when they were in the streets urging for democracy under President Musharraf, and they thought, here is the liberal middle class in Pakistan that, you know, represents hope for that country. Now they're in the many of them are in the streets, you know, cheering a murderer. And this section of Barelvi scholars, 500 Barelvi scholars came out afterwards. This is supposedly the Sufi, more moderate religious faction within Pakistan, as opposed to the Deobandis, and these are the guys who, you know, represent moderation, and they came out in support of this assassination. And people have taken aback, even some of Pakistan's defenders. You know, is this true? I mean, these are the people that we had been hedging our bets and counting on to be the moderate middle class. I won't mention too much more about that, except to say that Qadri, the man who assassinated Salman Taseer, was flagged as an extremist in 2004. And what happened? Was he demoted? He was promoted to the elite police unit that guarded the president and prime minister 18 times in 3 years and 2 foreign delegations. I couldn't make that up. I couldn't make that up if I wanted to. Many other things I'd like to discuss, but you know, I suppose the most important thing to touch upon is Afghanistan, because U.S.-Pakistan relations and Pakistan itself must be viewed in the context of Afghanistan, at least where we're coming from. When I try and put the pieces of this puzzle together and try and understand how, you know, the United States still provides this country with such aid in spite of all this evidence that is constantly being thrown at our face about some of the nefarious practices that some in the Pakistani government, some, not all, some in the Pakistani government are involved in, it really comes down to Afghanistan. That's the dirty little secret, is that we cannot do much until the Afghan war is over. Everyone is familiar with the drones operated by the CIA that hunt militants in Pakistan's tribal areas. Those are launched from within Pakistan, with Pakistan's consent. Pakistan patrols the border, the Afghan-Pakistan border. They don't do a very good job of securing it, but if they wanted to, they could make it a lot worse. And they provide the United States with intelligence, usually when it benefits them, when one of the militant groups that they've harbored and brought up over the years decides to turn its guns inward. Then the Pakistanis say, okay, we got to crack down on these guys, here's the intel, go get them. But most importantly, it's because of logistics. Supplying 100,000 coalition troops in Afghanistan several thousand miles away in desolate territory is a difficult task. And the United States, I mean, it used to be that some 80% of all our supplies went through Pakistan on 2 road links. The United States, we've done just about as much as we can to get that percentage down. We've opened up a northern distribution network through Central Asia and Russia. We have continued to airlift supplies in. We maintain an air base at Manas in Kyrgyzstan. But even with all that, we've been able to bring Pakistan's share of the logistics down to about 50%, and it just doesn't look like it can go much lower than that, just destined by geography. So until there is a change in the Afghan war, until the United States reduces its presence there, which will happen, there's not much that it can do to fundamentally change its relationship with Pakistan. We are hamstrung, and again, I'd quote from a piece that I will have out soon. We are hamstrung in facing a terrible dilemma. Confront Pakistan forcefully and risk suddenly and critically undermining the Afghan war effort, or continue playing the friendly benefactor and let Islamabad gradually undermine the war effort anyway. Most places refer to this as blackmail. In Washington, we call it a strategic partnership. And with some time, I'd also like to address China. China, as Vijay mentioned, is an interest of mine. Sino-Indian relations, fascinating. Nobody in the United States knows about them or cares. You'd think maybe the 2 largest countries in the world and how they interact with one another would be a topic of interest for the global superpower, but nobody seems to mind much. As many of you know, the last few years have been a time of heightened tensions between India and China. I don't want to overblow those tensions because there's still, diplomatic relations are still very much cordial. economic trade continues to grow. Wen Jiabao was just in India in December. He brought 400 business executives with him. Trade has ballooned to $60 billion a year now. They've set a goal for $100 billion a year in 2015. But the most contentious issues between India and China were not addressed during Wen Jiabao's visit. And just to touch on some of these briefly, you know, the stapled visas. I'm sure many of you have heard about the stapled visas issue. That goes back to 2007 when the Chinese said there was an Indian officer from Arunachal Pradesh who was to visit China, and the Chinese said, no, this visa is illegitimate. Citizens from their own country don't need visas to visit China. And obviously a snub to India saying, you know, challenging their sovereignty over Arunachal Pradesh. India, you know, they had been stapling visas for citizens from Arunachal for a while, stapling them to a separate piece of paper as a way of saying, look, you know, okay, Arunachal's a different status. It's not really an Indian state. We haven't decided what's going on with that yet. And then in 2009, they began doing it for Kashmiri residents too. And this raised a big furor in New Delhi, understandably, because it is essentially challenging Indian sovereignty over Kashmir. You know, there's no need for a separate to have a separate operation for Indian citizens from there unless you are trying to make a political point. And actually, very recently, they denied an Indian general from Kashmir a visa. So India's response was to suspend defense exchanges, which is understandable. Kashmir itself is an issue that some had hoped Wen Jiabao and Indian officials would be able to address. And there was again, no progress. China has been upgrading the Karakoram Highway in Pakistani-controlled Kashmir. China has plans to build 2 nuclear power plants in Pakistan. This is actually in contravention of its obligations. China joined the Nuclear Suppliers Group in 2004, and it promised not to supply nuclear materials to countries outside of the proliferation regime, like Pakistan. Now it's trying to go back on those words. The border disputes. I mentioned Arunachal Pradesh already. Cross-border forays. Some of you may be familiar with Brahmachalani. He's a prominent Indian scholar. He has stated that between 2006 and 2009, cross-border forays went from 140 to 270. Those are cross-border incursions by Chinese patrols. Some of them, you know, certainly innocent. Some of them minor provocations.